May I introduce to the audience the President of the National Government of the Republic of China.
在明期万岁
Long live the,
恭万岁
long live the revolutionary spirit of the nationalist China.
A fresh new face enters his life. The beautiful Mei Ling Sung, sister of Madame Sun Yat-sen, American-trained, well-mated. Jiang takes her hand in marriage to all his future thinking. By 1929, Jiang has built a majestic mausoleum for Sun Yat-sen at his new capital, Nanking. There, the body of the hero is brought. Pearl Buck wrote that day.
Chiang Kai-shek came in and roused great hopes in everyone. I remember the first time I ever saw him was at the funeral of Sun Yat-sen 4 years after Sun Yat-sen died. His embalmed body was brought to Nanking to be buried in the great new tomb on the mountain there. The first time I saw him face to face, a very striking man with very striking, bold black eyes. And he had a presence. And I think that he might have been a great first emperor if there had been a throne to sit upon. That was the tragedy, that the very structure of government was destroyed by the revolution. There wasn't a government, and he had to begin that government from the bottom, and he didn't understand government. He was a soldier, and he didn't know how to make a government. And he had plenty of advisors, most of them young PhDs from the United States, very impractical and idealistic, and they didn't know how to make a government. And all the time he had the communists to fight, and he also had the Japanese threatening. It was a very difficult situation. I'm never inclined to blame him.
To Westernize, this soldier's rule seems like the first firm government of China in many years. Jiang, too, is changing, for his wife, as much American in thought as Chinese, leads him to see the United States as friend, a source of loans and help. As new railways stretch their tracks across the country, the new Kuomintang order Jiang has brought begins to offer comfort and luxuries to the cities he controls. Industry booms, production soars. Engineers and young industrialists find, for the first time, careers opening to modern talents. Universities flourish, parade their graduates full of hope. In cities, department stores begin to offer Chinese taste of every modern wear. Modern dress takes subtle hold on Chinese fashion, while rich Chinese, in centers like Shanghai, begin enjoying privileges until now saved for foreigners.
I'm in dear old Shanghai, then I'm dancing, sweetheart, with you. And I'm in dear old Shanghai, when I'm out of the world. In my arms, dear, away from home, dear, we'll let the rest of the world go by. I'm waiting, we'll make love when I'm in old Shanghai.
Not such froth, however, but the primordial appeal of Chinese nationalism is changing Asian politics. Even in Manchuria, the call of patriotism twinges the conscience of warlord Jiang Solin, causing him to flout his Japanese protectors. Traveling by rail in summer 1928, Jiang Solin meets his death. A Japanese plot, blasting him to bits, punishes him for what they call his treachery. His son, young Marshal Jiang Suliang, succeeds to power in Manchuria. This junior warlord knows he must serve Japan as puppet or go with nationalism. He chooses Jiang. In Japan, this switch sets off alarm. Military men control Japan. They mobilize. They must strike soon. They know if Jiang extends his sway to vast Manchuria, if China's 400 million people unify, then they must certainly lose the Asian mainland. September 18, 1931. Attack begins which Marshal Jiang Suliang's warlord soldiers cannot stop, and Chiang Kai-shek is powerless to help. Striking simultaneously at half a dozen different points, the soldiers of Japan seize towns and rails. By spring of 32, they hold all Manchuria, rename it Manchukuo, a puppet state at their command. Rage sweeps China. Generals exhort their troops to stand by for the counterblow, demand a war of national resistance to Japan, right now. For Jiang, the problem pinches. His foot soldier armies may be stronger than old warlord armies, yet they lack tanks, have old artillery, are just beginning to understand the airplane. He knows they cannot match the modern weapons of Japan. Not only that, he leads a nation still divided. The communists, struck down for good in 1927, have somehow swelled by 32 to major force again.
It was as if a ghost had risen from the dead. When Mao had fled in 27 with his 1,000 communist zealots, he was already disgusted with Borodin and clumsy Russian doctrine. He felt the key to revolution in Asia lay in the peasants of the countryside, not the big city proletariat. 80% of all China's peasants lived in bleak and filthy villages, treated like brutes, imprisoned by officials, landlords, or loan sharks, and Mao's idea was simple. Turn the hidden peasant anger against the local gentry, the local rich, as well as the unknown foreigner. Let terror claim revenge by stealth and night. Use pitchfork, guns, knives, grenades. Give guns to anger. Out of this idea, he created this black miracle of his, the doctrine of partisan warfare. Divide the land among the landless. Rip out roads, bridges, railways, so that formal armies will have to slog on foot, dissolve in garrisons, bog down. Transform the countryside into a total environment of hate. Let women, children, everyone, not be afraid to die. It was political warfare raised to the nth degree, and by 1932, he controlled a good chunk of the two provinces of Hunan and Jiangxi and claimed the loyalty of 9 million people.
Jiang insists he cannot resist Japan unless he first has crushed this enemy within. From 1930 to 1935, he drives his troops to fight. His narrow military politics sees only one solution. Force must root out Mao's ideas with bayonets. With communism, no compromise. Year after year, this civil war goes on as expedition after expedition grinds into failure in peasant ambuscade, guerrilla war. An American newsreel of the early 1930s innocently reports this nameless civil war.
Troubled China turns on the enemy within her gates. These bombing planes of the Nanking government get ready to attack the rebel strongholds in Kiangsai. Contact! High over the mountains, Movie Tone flies with the air forces of President Chiang Kai-shek. This is an actual bombing raid, and as we sight the first of the rebel villages, we commence the attack. Chiang Kai-shek is making desperate efforts to unite the various provinces of China, many of which are torn by internal dissension. And if he can't do it one way, he tries another, including bombs. China, Far East, land of ancient culture, land of bloodshed, rebellion, and war.
By 1934, Jiang has forged a blockhouse ring around Mao's communists, and squeezing ever tighter, feels certain they are trapped.
Then one of the most amazing episodes in history took place. As Jiang squeezed, they oozed, dissolving into tiny bands. They oozed through his fingers. In October 34, 90,000 men and women set out. Not just an army, but a government, an idea, carrying all their records with them on these little yo-yo sticks on what they called the Long March. It's a 6,000-mile trek they made from Jiangxi in Hunan, south to Guizhou and up to the Guizhou Plateau and up across the foothills of Tibet and then down again out of the mountains, down into
Shenxi, where in these dry and windswept hills they made their base. 90,000 had set out. They arrived a year later in October 1935. 20,000 left, and there they were to dig in. This is how Westerners saw them in these yellow barren hills, where, calling peasants to their cause, they finally fended off Jiang's pursuit.
In 1936, however, Mao's line changes. He calls for unity against Japan. Rich and poor must stand together, an end to civil war. Nationalist, communist, warlord, all must stand as brothers against the alien threat. This new line appeals to millions, but not to Chiang Kai-shek. He, his inner councils, and his generals persist. Final mop-up of the communists must still go on, entrusted now to friendly warlord generals in the north. Yet mysteriously, this final mop-up stalls. The most important front against the communists is held by soldiers of Manchuria, driven out by Japanese. These homesick troops have little stomach for killing other Chinese. Led by young Marshal Zhang Suliang, they itch to tackle Japanese. In December 1936, Zhang flies off to see the young marshal in Xi'an, to flog him on to sterner effort. In Xi'an, however, communists have convinced the young marshal that civil war must stop.
Then there happens one of those episodes that sound as if they were written in the book of make-believe. And again, we have no photographs because no one invites a photographer to witness a kidnapping, which was what happened next. Jiang was there to urge them to fight the communists, and on the night of December 11th, he was sleeping in a villa outside of town when he was awakened by gunfire. And the young marshal and his troops were shooting their way into his villa and trying to kidnap him. Jiang was in his nightshirt and bare feet. He slipped out the back way, tried to climb over the wall, fell. He hurt his back. He lost his false teeth. His feet were bleeding as he ran over the rocks, and the young marshal's soldiers caught him and brought him back. It sounds mad, but that's the way China was, and it got even madder, because when they brought him back, they invited the communists down from North Shenxi, and on December 15th, the communists, the young marshal, and Jiang all sat down to talk. The communists and the young marshal said to Chiang Kai-shek, "It's time to end the civil war. We must all unite against the Japanese, or else." They could have killed him, but they didn't. And Chiang Kai-shek agreed. He would halt the civil war, and he would form a united front against the Japanese. And so on Christmas Day, they gave him a plane, and Chiang Kai-shek and the young marshal flew down to Nanking to announce the civil war was over. But Jiang had made no promises to the young marshal, so he imprisoned him immediately and kept him prisoner ever after, even to this day in exile on Formosa.
Christmas 1936. At Nanking, members of the government await their president's return. In pain, he hobbles out, announces to the world, a popular front of Kuomintang and communists will now, united under his command, turn to face the menace of Japan. Japan's imperial tradition has, however, a cardinal rule: always strike first. July 1937. The war is on. The Japanese now seek total conquest, not just another chunk of territory. They blast the heart of China in the Yangtze Valley, with Shanghai first to take the shock. The Imperial Navy shells Shanghai at point-blank range. A century since Britain first blasted China open. A generation since the bloodshed of the Boxers. Babies have grown to manhood without a year of peace. For 25 years, China has lived with warlords, guns, and terror. But now it must drink deeper of the cup of bitterness.
Nanking this morning had its 28th raid. I am speaking to you just as the echoes of exploding bombs have died down. Death comes from the clear blue sky, just as it has come to thousands of our innocent people throughout the length of our land.
November, Shanghai falls. December, Nanking is sacked and raped. Through winter and spring 38, the Japanese push up the Yangtze, destroying the decade-long achievement of Chiang Kai-shek, ravaging the cities on which all future hope of nationalist China rests. In the north, a different vision of tomorrow's China guides the communists. In a village in a mountain gulch, they make a capital, Yan'an. Headquarters have paper windows, furnishings of bamboo. Their troops are called the Chinese 8th Route Army. But the United Front dissolves. Red generals ignore Jiang's orders. Their strategy makes an independent war against Japan. In rear areas like Yan'an, soldiers raise their food. Mao himself grows tobacco. Zhu De, the Red Army's commander-in-chief, hoes his own cabbage patch. Peasant women spin and sew the cloth for uniforms, fashion straw sandals for the soldiers. The mind of Mao Zedong sees warfare differently from other men.
I remember Mao Zedong saying to me that Americans thought the communists would lose, that they saw the communists in the hills of Yan'an walking around with straw sandals, a ragamuffin army, and he said that any wise European who had seen George Washington's people at Valley Forge would have said that George Washington was going to lose. He said, it's true, he said, that the Japanese and Chiang Kai-shek have electricity, airplanes, tanks, and we have nothing, he said. But then he said, the British had all those things and George Washington didn't have electricity, and yet George Washington won. You suddenly realize with a start that Mao Zedong was not really sure of when and in what century electricity was introduced. That the structure of his knowledge was totally different from the structure of Chiang Kai-shek's and ours.
Mao's knowledge of Asian war, however, is unmatchable. With these generals, he lifts the doctrine of partisan warfare to new levels. Lin Biao directs Kang Da, training school for guerrilla leaders. Zhu De deploys guerrilla bands in his rear. Guerrillas are like fish swim in the sea. Within a year, such troops gather 200,000 peasant soldiers. The Japanese may seize cities, but the 8th Route Army holds all North China countryside about them. In the Yangtze Valley, however, all through summer '38, fortress after fortress of Chiang Kai-shek falls. The Japanese crunch on. By October, his last 2 citadels are doomed. First Canton, then 4 days later, Hankow falls. Killing prisoners, spreading horror where they go, the Japanese convince themselves that sheer stark terror will now at last persuade the nationalists to quit. The war is won. Yet still their prey eludes them. From Hankow, Jiang has planned retreat. His government is to settle at Chongqing, in China's deepest mountain fastness, Sichuan. The nationalists set out. Pack laborers salvage from the burning cities what few machines they can. Students haul away school libraries. Beyond the mountains lies the safety of the Sichuan Basin, its only entry by the cleft the Yangtze cuts. A steeper climb, say Chinese poets, than the climb to heaven itself. Retreat continues all through winter, expression of a will to fight that no disaster has diminished. Up through these gorges, they pull or pole their boats, until finally, in 1939, the rearmost echelon of the sad procession drags through. Behind, they scorch a trackless belt of no man's land to guard these last interior strongholds from the Japanese. Chongqing is now the wartime capital, a city of another age, almost unchanged in sight or smell or sound from Manchu China. And here, among these backward peasants, the government digs in. Spurning all Japanese peace proposals, the Chinese brace themselves for certain havoc. And in the spring of '39, it comes. Day and night the bomb continues. Powerless to strike back, Jiang knows only a
against Japan and its strategy.
almost as an afterthought, he said, "Remember, the Japanese are a disease of the skin, but the communists are a disease of the heart." It seemed odd to me because at that time the Japanese were bombing the daylights out of both Chiang Kai-shek and the communists, both of whom were allied against the Japanese. But now in retrospect, it seems to me an almost prophetic remark, almost a vision of an apocalypse to come.